Lynette is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all variously streaming from today. I'm Wurundjeri country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present here and in whatever country you might be listening in from today. Very exciting to have a very wonderful Mike Mahony speaking for us tonight. Everybody that is here for the first time, you have picked a good night to be here for the first time. And I similarly welcome everybody back that has been with us before. It's always so great to have you. If you wouldn't mind turning off your videos and mute yourself for the talk, it's a bit less distracting for Mike. That'd be really great. And I should remind you all as well, this is being recorded too. So if you've got somebody with you that's not supposed to be there, then definitely turn your videos off. That'd be great. So I think I better introduce the really wonderful, truly respected herpetologist, Professor Michael Mahony. Mike is well known to many of us in the audience, as well as many of us on the Frog Fit Committee, well liked by all of us and all of his past students as well. He's had a very long, very prestigious career that I won't ruin any of his surprises tonight by telling you too much about, but I cannot tell you how excited I am that we are still online and therefore have interstate speakers like Mike, who is truly wonderful. So Mike, I think I will hand over to you and let you present Fire, Flood and Pestilence, but not a plague of frogs. Thank you very much for joining
us. Thanks very much, Lynette, and please let me know if something happens with my volume or some other things are going on.
Okay, thank you.
I've got earphones on, and so if something else happens in the background, I can't hear it. And I am not accustomed to talking where I can't see faces, so I apologise to everybody. I really do like to be able to look at an audience and tell whether they have got something that I just said and know whether I need to actually take a step sideways and explain something.
Would you like our videos on then, Mike?
I beg your pardon?
Would you like us to turn our videos on? Because I'm sure we'd be happy to oblige.
No, it's fine. It's just something that, you know, Zoom just can't get there compared with being in alive. So I'm sure everybody in Victoria would love to be at a meeting where you all could meet one another too. It's hard times, so we all appreciate that. And I would at the beginning say hello to quite a lot of friends who are in the audience, I noticed there, so that's really nice. But to all those people who are my friends, you've heard it all before, so go and get a coffee. I won't speak for too long. I would prefer to give people a chance to ask questions. So if you've got questions, please write them down, and I'm happy to try and address questions rather than speak for a long time. So we've all been through the fire, and that was followed by the flood. And we've been dealing with pestilence for 30 or 40 years for Australian frogs, with the disease chytridiomycosis. And so all of them together, fire, flood and pestilence, but not a plague of frogs. So they're doing pretty badly, unfortunately. So I'm pressing Lynette to go to the next screen, but it's not happening and I don't know why.
I think you've got control of it, Mike.
I've got control of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I have got control of it. I'm trying to work out why it's not going.
If you try clicking your mouse on the screen and then pressing the cursor keys, that's how sometimes I get through.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there we go. Sorry, folks. Okay, title. I should say right at the beginning that the work I'm going to talk about is not all done by me. It wouldn't be possible without people in the last 12 or really 14 months who have done work on, you know, the impact of the fires on frogs in New South Wales. I'd like to start off with a bit of a, really debunking a myth, and that's the canaries in the mine myth. Look, we know that frogs are sensitive to environmental degradation, and having a two-stage life cycle, particularly with your embryos and your tadpoles in water and a moist skin and naked embryos, means that if there are pollutants put into the water, then that's not good. But by and large, and I mean by and large, it's not everywhere, but by and large in Australia, we don't have massive problems with chemical pollutants in our water. It happens, I know it happens, but this is not the cause of massive frog declines or extinctions in Australia. In fact, I can't think of one example of a frog extinction in Australia or a major decline that's been because of bad water quality or pollutants. I mean, the closest we come to it is perhaps the addition of pesticides and herbicides in some large agricultural areas like the cotton industry in Western New South Wales. And they work hard so that that doesn't happen. I mean, that really comes to the second point. Well, why am I concerned about the canaries in the mine thing is more often than not, if I have an interview with a journalist, they know a couple of things about frogs and they always come, oh, they're the canaries in the mine. And I always think, oh, no. It's not about pollution. It's about chytrid, which has been the cause of frog in our last 40 years. So I really think that over that time, amphibian biologists have been consumed with that one problem, trying to understand chytridiomycosis, how to deal with it, how to mitigate it. And why is it important to the most recent disaster, the wildfires, the mega fires of 2019-20, is that frogs were already being brought low. The critical impact of chytrid is to isolate populations of a lot of frogs and to reduce their abundance. Now, together, those things tell us that their resilience has been lost. They are hanging on sometimes, and some species, in only a portion of what was their former distribution. Now, you know, there has been focus on other issues. Not all amphibian biologists work on the effect of chytrid. There's a growing interest in climate change impacts, and fire is an outcome of climate change. I mean, all of the indications that I can see from meteorologists and people who report on the changing of our climate say that the wildfires, well, were predicted, and they happened because we're in the hottest 5 years that we'd ever recorded. And in eastern New South Wales, we're in the longest drought that we'd ever recorded in 2019. There are other issues that are associated with chytrid, habitat restoration and ecology, but most of the studies are justified around the problem of dealing with the disease. And on top of that, then the impact of fires have really received little attention from ecologists. So if you go back to the Garneau report and then to a book that I'd encourage you all to read called Flammable Australia, which was published in 2012, more than one author in that book predicted that bushfires in Australia were going to increase in frequency and severity because of climate change. And that happened starting about the middle of 2019. In total, 1.8 million hectares of forest and woodland burned across eastern Australia. It commenced in the hottest and driest year on record, and it burned an unprecedented extent of scleropforest, coastal heathlands, and rainforests. In fact, particularly disturbing was that an estimated 53%, or 190,000 hectares of the Gondwana rainforest of Australia's World Heritage area burned. The figures for the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area are worse. I don't know what they are, but they must come close to 80 or 90%. But the difference is that the Blue Mountains is a World Heritage that is declared because of the great diversity of eucalypts. And we know eucalypts evolved with fire. The Gondwana rainforests of Australia are World Heritage because they're rainforest. And for 53% of the rainforest to burn was an event that we've rarely or never seen before. Yeah, every now and then there's a wildfire that burns into the edge of rainforest habitats, occasionally, but 53% is truly unprecedented. And I would just say something about that. This changes the scenery a little bit. These fires are not just Australia's problem. When Australia, the Australian government on our behalf, signed up to the World Heritage Convention, and we nominated the Gondwana rainforests of Australia as World Heritage, we are now the stewards of that World Heritage for the people of the world. It's not just Australian heritage, it's World Heritage. And like when the Great Barrier Reef goes through a bleaching episode, the UNESCO comes to Australia and says, we are now to list the Great Barrier Reef as World Heritage in danger. And as you know, the Australian government worked very, very quickly to say, no, we don't want that. Delegates go out, a whole lot of work goes on, all sort of backroom saying, no, we're doing our best. Well, after the Gondwana rainforest of Australia, 53% burnt, UNESCO also released a statement that they'd moved the Gondwana rainforest of Australia off a ranking in the way they rank how World Heritage is managed from secure to being at risk. The next step is to move it towards World Heritage in danger. And that's a great embarrassment for our government. And I suppose one hopes that that sort of embarrassment would lead them to do something. But yeah, that's for them to make a decision. So two things have changed in our lifetime and are changing very rapidly. Wildfires are becoming more intense. They are hotter, and the extent of the fires is much greater than we've ever dealt with before. And once again, the literature is quite clear about this. There are certain people who have mapped intensity and extent. And since the Black Saturday fires in Victoria in 2009, to the 2019 fires, to the Queensland fires that started in 2018, this pattern is quite clear. So what do we know about frogs and fire? I did a quick search around. There are 14 or 15 studies. The habitats where those studies have been conducted is mostly sclerophyll forest and Banksia woodlands. 3 of the 14 studies report on high intensity fires. 9 deal with low intensity or what we'd call controlled burn. One's a review, and one looked at what we call threats and traits, life history and ecology, to try and relate how frogs were dealing with fire. The low intensity fires, 9 of them, report minimal or no impact. And the object of the studies was really to understand whether practices of fire hazard reduction burns were affecting amphibians. And it's a good news story. Low intensity fires, if conducted the right way, probably aren't harmful as long as there's a reasonable return interval, that they're not burned too often, that the community composition changes, because community composition is also important to the frogs. And by community composition, I mean the vegetation community. The high intensity studies are the ones that are most interesting. One of them reports the extinction of a local population of upland species. A second one reports the change of effective population size because they use genetics to measure the before and after impact of the fire. And that's a really interesting study because that happened after the Black Saturday fires in Victoria. It was conducted near Kingslake. And what they had there was, I suppose, serendipity, good luck that they, but good luck comes because of good management. For a long period of time, the scientists were studying a transect of pond frogs, Laturia ewingi and Laturia para-ewingi, in a transect that had been set up by Murray Littlejohn some 30 years ago. And in the last 7 years, they were, before the fires, they were doing some to add to the long series of studies on those pond frogs. And then the fires happened and they went back and collected more genetic material, tissues from the animals. And it was then they found that the population had lost its genetic diversity and the number of reproductive females was greatly reduced. But the counts of animals that they were making around ponds didn't seem to be impacted. There's a great warning there to us that when we go and count animals, we are not actually seeing everything that's going on. And so I actually think that that study's a game changer, because in the future, these are powerful tools that are available to us to understand what the impacts are on populations of something like a fire that we can't quite often detect when we just count animals, particularly something as small as a frog, whose detection varies so much because of good rain, bad rain, and being there on the right night and so on. That study also then reported a reduction in occupancy and abundance for the frogs that they were looking at. So up until now, I can't find any trait-based analysis for frogs and fires. There's a trait-based analysis, two trait-based analysis trying to understand the impact of chytrid and one for gambusia. Now, what's a trait? A trait is an adaptation, a feature of the biology of the frog, which enables it to escape fire. So one of the things that, apart from doing a lot of field work, is to try and understand, well, how do frogs deal with fire? And what are the traits that enable that? And to do an analysis of those traits to see whether frogs can deal with wildfire. This is just a table which I'm happy to share with people, and hopefully will be published in a couple of months. This is just the list of the table goes through the 14 studies. I've listed the species in the community that was studied, where it was undertaken, the fire intensity, the method. Some of them are desktop, some of the field. And while they didn't mention traits, if you read the papers carefully, most of the papers do talk about things that we call traits, like the life history traits. They talk about the importance of life history, body size, testis mass, clutch size, oversize, things that give frogs some resilience or susceptibility to fire, or the capacity to respond to fire. So a frog that lays a large number of eggs, if it survives a fire, can very rapidly return to a habitat because it's got a large number of propagules. And they can do that within 12 months. Whereas you think of a koala, it only has 1 or 2 young every year, if that. A female frog that has a large number of eggs can have up to 1,000 offspring. If there's no competition, they can bounce back from a disaster very quickly. So these are called traits which are important either to deal with the fire or to respond to the fire if they. And so I suppose as all scientists do, the first thing that we did literature review to see, well, what has been said by people who have conducted experiments in the field and empirical studies on fire and frogs. One of the other interesting ones that some of you may be involved with is that the citizen science project Frog ID, managed out of the Australian Museum by Jodie Rowley, reported very quickly after the fires with a paper looking at the pre and post-fire assessment based on the number of submissions of calling that was sent to them pre and post the fire. It's really quite amazing because there were some 2,000 community observations, and it was a good news story because there were frogs that were recorded on the fire ground within months after the fire had been extinguished. The bad news part of it is that most of the frogs that were reported are things that we know are common and widespread, not threatened. And there were very few of, in fact, there were no recordings of some species which would be of conservation concern. So, but nonetheless, it once again, it's like the genetics. It's a powerful new tool to help conservation biologists see what's going on, because there are eyes in many places, not just where the scientists go. So I've already mentioned the intense burns, the Victorian wildfires of 2009, that beautiful study that used genetics, how it took advantage of pre-impact information. The normal approach was to look at what we call demography, which is how many there are and where there are, and they couldn't see a difference, but the population genetics showed a marked impact. The second study that shows a bad outcome from an intense wildfire was on the Dorrigo Plateau in 1995. It was a fortunate study, once again, some sort of serendipity. Frank Lemkirk was studying the frog there, Asa darlingtoni, because of concerns about the impact of forestry on that frog. So he had replicated sites, multiple populations that were surveyed numerous times. Then the wildfire occurred in 1995, and he was able to go back to the sites which he'd been studying. And it was then that he found that one population, it was a small isolated population where the fire was particularly intense, the frogs had disappeared completely. In another one, another area, there was a population that was larger, and he reported an 80% decrease in the population, and his method was to count calling males. And it took another 6 years for that population to recover even slightly. So the outcome of that study was to show that intense fires can cause isolated populations to disappear and can cause significant reduction in larger and connected populations. So two of the studies that have dealt with intense fires give us a bit of a warning that these are not going to be easily handled by frogs. Now, the next thing that we need to appreciate about frogs, and I'm sure I'm talking to the converted and the knowledgeable here, is that frogs are ectotherms, and the physiology of ectotherms is something we have to keep in mind. So the thermal biology of frogs is that they are the same temperature as the environment. They're small size. The largest frog's up to 10 centimeters long, and the average is probably about 20 or 30 millimeters, 2 centimeters to 3 centimeters long. And that, because of small size, they rapidly equilibrate with the environment. They can't control their temperature up and down. If they sit on a cold rock, within a half an hour, they're going to be the same temperature as the rock. They sit in the sun on a warm rock, and some of them do that of a nighttime after a sunny day. They can stay warm for a few extra hours, taking some moisture, some temperature out of the rock. The next thing we need to know about their thermal biology is they have what we call a low thermal tolerance. They have a critical thermal maximum, CT max. Most frogs can't withstand temperatures more than 34 degrees. And if you hold them at 34 degrees for very long, they will die. Now, how long? 15 minutes is enough. Now, at the lower end, frogs are fine. They can go right down almost to freezing. In fact, they can handle the thermal lower range much better than we can. But they can't withstand high temperatures. A frog above 34 degrees has to get into somewhere cool and normally into some water very quickly, or it will die. Now, it's not a common thing that's been studied in Australian frogs. I expect in the next decade we're going to see a lot more work done on thermal tolerance, because climate change and fires mean that we need to understand some of these things far more carefully. The next thing about the physiology of ectotherms and frogs is water balance. Desiccation is a major issue for frogs. They've got moist skin and lungs. They lose water to the atmosphere unless they do something to stop water evaporating from the skin. Now, some tree frogs can wipe themselves, and you keep frogs, you see them doing this. They can wipe themselves with their hand across their face, and from their glands on the skin, they can secrete a waxy layer, and that can limit evaporation. So things like green tree frogs, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprising, Latoria chloris, the red-eyed green tree frog. So frogs that actually live in the sun, so we think chloris lives in the top of the canopy of trees, it's in the sun. Ceruleae, the green tree frog, can also bask in the sun. So these are frogs that do this, and they limit the loss of water. This is best adapted when you get to the north of Australia in the monsoon and savanna forests. So more of the frogs in the hot, dry savannas have a waxy secretion that prevents evaporation, because they have to spend half of the year in hot and dry conditions. The next thing is that frogs can do, and I'm sure you've seen this many times, is when moisture is low, they can move into a tight posture where they limit the exposure of their skin to the air. They minimize the surface area to volume ratio and reduce loss of water. And desert frogs will even go a step further and secrete several layers of skin which they don't eat or slough off, that dries, and they look like they're in a glad bag, and we call that a cocoon, and that will prevent up to 80% of evaporative water loss from a cocooning frog. So these are adaptations to deal with desiccation. Now, a frog doesn't even drink. Could ask you, how many times have you seen a frog drink? Lizards drink, mammals drink, birds drink. Frogs don't drink. All they have to do is sit on moist soil, and they can absorb moisture from the soil. And they can actually release a hormone which enables them to do that from the soil would appear to be dry to us, but it gives them a capacity to absorb moisture through the skin. Now, they have to do that to maintain their water balance. Now, why have I spent time on thermal biology and water balance, physiology? Because it seems to us that, and I'm talking about our group that's done this large trait analysis of frogs in a process called an expert elicitation, that the way frogs deal with fire is that they can't flee fire. They are not like birds and mammals, and some mammals can't flee. A koala can't do much about a fire. Most birds get confused, but many of them can flee. But look, frogs just don't have a chance. They have made their decision well before the fire has arrived. So before the fire arrived, we were in months and months of drought, and it was hot for days and days. So what does a frog do? it seeks out a shelter site which is cool and moist. Now, this is an adaptation. This is not something that's just by chance. Over millions of years of evolution, frogs have developed a behaviour where they can seek out shelter sites. And I don't know how they do it, but certain tree frogs will go back to the same hollow in a tree year after year. They come out of it for spring and go to the pond, and they go back and they know exactly where that hollow is in the tree. Now, sadly, when we went looking for literature where people had reported this, there's hardly any. There's a couple of nice studies in the Northern Territory where physiologists looked at green tree frogs going into tree hollows and how they, like more than just one communal sort of shelter site, how they would come and go, and if the night air was dry, how they would stay in their hollow, everything as you would expect. But in the forests of Eastern Australia, so right through Gippsland and up the East Coast, in the temperate forests, there's hardly any reports or studies of frogs and the behaviour of tree frogs of going to shelter sites in hollows. I have only one anecdotal story. A former student of mine, he was a consultant, a fauna consultant, and a bat biologist, not a frog biologist. And one of his jobs was to be at a clearance, a habitat clearance site for a mine. And they were required to have ecologists there. So when they brought down big trees in the old growth forests, they could rescue what they thought would be mainly things like possums and maybe some birds that were in these deep hollows. And he said to me that they, out of maybe 30 or 40 old growth trees they brought down, they're getting odd things down. Then he was interested in the bats, obviously, but they brought down this old iron bark. And he said when it split out on the ground, down in the middle of it in what they call the mud guts was just about 50 frogs. He said he'd never seen anything like it. 2 or 3 different species, and they're all down in this deep fissure and hollow down in the guts of the trees, where the termites historically had brought up soil and clay, and that then held moisture. So the middle of the tree was this moist, muddy mess, and foresters will tell you they call these mud guts. They're not uncommon, uncommon in eucalypt trees. And so that's the only example I know of where somebody has actually seen what we know is what we expect tree frogs to do when it's very hot, and they do it for the whole of their winter hibernation, is that they go to a place where the temperature remains stable and the moisture is confirmed. That's the only way they can survive. And we actually think that this is probably what is happening in wildfires. Frogs are not going to flee. It's starting to get dry and hot well before the fire. Tree frogs will go into hollows and find places where the temperature is stable and where there's moisture. Ground frogs will look for a very large rotten log on the ground, rocky scree slope, or burrow into the topsoil. In fact, when our group of experts ranked these traits for Australian frogs, independently, they said that these traits occurred for burrowing frogs and for arboreal frogs. And as you might expect, the frogs, therefore, that are at most concern are the frogs that don't burrow and don't go into deep crevices. And these are the leaf litter frogs. And the leaf litter frogs that rely on moisture from the forest floor are the ones most impacted by a very hot fire, burning, as we saw in parts of New South Wales, totally scorching the ground and burning all of the organic matter even in the topsoil so that it became powdery and ash. Any frog that's a ground frog that lives in the first couple of centimetres of the soil and in the leaf litter would be killed. Now, why do these frogs not have adaptations like the other ones? Well, they've always lived in cool, moist forests. They don't come out of those forests. And when the fires came, they had no way to deal with it. So hollows and burrows are critical components of the environment. Some of the literature call these micro-refugia. So in dry forest environments, in sclerophyll forest, they are most important because tree frogs will go to hollows and ground frogs will go to burrows. So these are what we call traits. They are part of the morphology, the physiology, and the behavior of frogs. And they are adaptations that have developed over millennia, millions of years, to live in dry environments. And at times, even when we don't have fires, dry sclerophyll forest, dry ridges and ridge tops, as occurs right along the forests of the temperate forests of Eastern Australia, frogs have evolved to deal with that. They don't have such good physiological adaptations if they are adapted to wet forest and if they're rainforest species. And that's why when the rainforest burnt, we were so concerned, because the frogs there don't have those adaptations to burrow deeply or to find hollows. It's interesting that amongst in our expert elicitation process, we are not able to identify any specific trait that is an adaptation to fire. Many plants have adaptations that are clearly to deal with fire. Most eucalypts have epicormic growth. That is, when crown fire burns them and their bark is burnt, if they're not killed, they can sprout from beneath the bark. Some of our heath plants set seed, and it will only germinate when there's fire and there's smoke from fire. In fact, some biologists even think they use fire to give them a competitive advantage over other plants. Now, we can find no such trait in Australian frogs. In fact, when you start to look at any animal, it's fairly hard to find traits that are clearly adaptations to fire. So some of our small native rodents in the genus Pseudomys do go through a fire succession, and it seems to be their advantage by fire. It opens up the environment. Perhaps it's easier for them to feed, gives them an advantage over their competitors. But it's really hard to, for example, find any reptile or bird that's got specific fire adaptations. I just go through the sort of what a trait analysis is. These are the sorts of things that we asked experts to score: dominant, adult, habitat, shelter type. And we had subcategories of all of these things. There were 18 trait categories. The first thing we actually asked the experts to do was to say, which of these traits is the most important to deal with fire? And we used the word sensitivity or resilience, like which trait makes a frog most sensitive to, and we scored 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 for those in subcategories. And so after doing that, we end up with summing the scores of the experts, and we get a total. And these are examples of trait scores, and these are trait scores for the tree frogs. And so a high trait score means that you're sensitive. And interestingly enough, the expert thought that these two frogs, Latoria chloris and Latoria gracilenta, had the highest trait score. They are frogs that live in the canopy. And when I look at the individual scores and see what was going on there, what the experts were thinking is, well, for some of our forests, the canopy totally burned. And not only that, there were large swathes of our eucalypt forests where the trees were burned. And these are hollow, as I've already said, these frogs either live in the canopy under bark or find a hollow. And the fires were so intense that they would have died in any one of those places, even deep in a hollow, unless it was a very big old growth tree where there was some buffering just the mass of the tree, these frogs wouldn't survive. Other high scores, for example, were received by this group. Satropa is a frog permanent stream frog, but subglandulosa and Davisii in northern New South Wales, northeastern New South Wales, which are related to Satropa at high altitude, above 600, 800 metres, quite often in upland heaths and hanging swamps. And some of that country burnt particularly badly, and they got a very high trait score. Interestingly, there was also a high trait score for this group, the Latoria wingi complex, and that bears some extra support for that study after the Black Saturday fires, where the genetics found that that group of frogs was particularly affected. And so when we added up a whole 18 traits, they came out above, like the Philocroa group, in nice, cool, wet, permanent streams in riparian zones, reasonably large reproductive output, and frogs that we know go into deep logs for protection when it's hot. So in Victoria, you would know that mainly because of Latoria nudibdigita. And of course, Latoria spenceri should fit into that group. It's not included here. We did the same for ground frogs. Perhaps not surprisingly, the frog that had the highest sensitivity score was Acer darlingtoni, a small frog, lives in the leaf litter in wet sclerophyll forest and rainforest. Lots of rainforest burnt. This frog lays its eggs in the leaf litter. So the drought and then the fire was predicted to, if it got to the habitat of these frogs, to be particularly dangerous. Now, fortunately, only something like about 5 or 10% of their habitat was burnt. In the border ranges in northern New South Wales and on the Dorrigo Plateau were 2 areas of rainforest. There was some burning around the edge, but not so bad. So fortunately, this fire, the one in 2019-20, was not the one that got darlingtoni, but who knows what the next one will do. Interestingly, a frog that came out fairly high in this group was Geocrinia victoriana. It only just comes into New South Wales in the far southeast, and it's far more common, obviously, in Victoria, right through Gippsland. I'd be interested to know what all you Victorians think about our expert ranking that high. It ranked high because it has terrestrial egg laying, or at the edge of permanent boggy areas. It lives in very wet places, cool forests, but it's terrestrial, lives on the ground, leaf litter, small size. It ended up getting quite a high rank score, along with a bunch of pseudophonaries, which rank pretty high because they're all the same. They live on the ground, live in the leaf litter, have a small reproductive output. Okay, so I just try to simplify all of that to this diagram, which one of former students put together. So thanks very much, John Gould. So this is a schematic diagram how frogs survive fire, or the intrinsic traits that make a frog sensitive or resilient to fire, whichever way you want to look at that dichotomy, sensitivity or resilience. So if you live up here, you're hot and you can burn. If you live in leaf litter, that's the worst place to be in a forest fire. That's very hot. You get some protection if you're in the soil. You get more protection if you're up in the canopy, and under bark, you get more protection, and then crevices. If you move to an ephemeral pool or water, pond or stream, more protection. Tree hollow should give you strong protection. And if you burrow deeply, you've got the best protection of all. Population size was also a strong indicator of fire sensitivity. So that just says that if you're already isolated, your population is small, then the chance of a fire stochastically burning out your last population gets higher and higher. And as we've known in conservation biology for a long, long time, the moment you start get down to small, isolated populations, then stochastic events happen. A stochastic event is an unpredicted event, could happen this year, next year, but it can be a large enough event that it just wipes out the last total area of a species. So we do have a few examples of that in the fires in New South Wales. One that worries us greatly, our research group, is Little John's tree frog, which you guys will now know as a new species for you, Latoria watsoni. In eastern New South Wales, unfortunately, we know that frog from 3 main isolated populations. And in those populations, they're not incredibly abundant. And unfortunately, the population in the Blue Mountains was right in the middle of an intense fire. The population in the Central Coast Range was on the edge of the fire and didn't burn. Like how we saved, or how the fire authorities saved the Central Coast Range, I don't know. For days, we watched the warnings along the road where they fought what was called the Gospers Mountain Fire, which came out of the Blue Mountains and was running right towards the coast. And for a while there was predicted to run right to the coast at Gosford and to the back of Newcastle, but they stopped it. So what happened for Little John's tree frog is that one of the 3 known surviving populations or regions was burnt, and the 2 others, the Central Coast Range and then down at the Warrenora Plateau, weren't. But whose chance or whose turn is it next time? And this is how species can be wiped out in very short periods of time. The other thing that the experts thought was very important was adult habitat. That if you lived in swamps and wetlands, you were probably okay because there was a lot of moisture and that could reduce the heat. Riparian zones were probably better than rainforest, and then forest or dry forest. If you live in the leaf litter of a dry forest or a heath, you're probably in the worst position. So that if that's one of your traits, the habitat you live in, that's a bad sign. And the other thing that was generally agreed on is that frogs with specialized reproductive mode, like Acidarlingtoni with parental care, small numbers of eggs, like the Pseudophony species, they were going to be more affected and would not respond if they were affected because they have a low reproductive output than frogs in terrestrial and aquatic situations, and mainly aquatic streams and large swamps over ponds. So for those of you who are interested in the science of this, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, I will just reiterate, graph A shows the environmental temperature and what we call the performance curve of a frog. And so frogs show this bell-shaped curve where at somewhere, and I didn't put bounds in here, somewhere between 18 degrees and 24 degrees, frogs have their optimal performance. Their metabolism is optimized, their jumping, their heart rate, everything is running optimum. And if a frog heats up to about above, 34 for some forest frogs, but 28 degrees for mountain frogs like Phaloria and Assa, once they go past that threshold, they go to what's called their critical thermal maximum. They can't perform. In fact, they die. And it's around about here, or a little bit more up here, is that they've got to go into a micro refuge. So when the forest was heating up before the fire, that was a sign for the frogs to find a micro refuge. Now, the same happens for moisture. As the environmental moisture goes down from 100% and it's getting drier and drier, there becomes a threshold where the frog must go to moisture in a micro refuge. Now, these two things work together, but they are also independent. If it's warm and dry, the frog, if the temperature's ideal but dry, it's still got to go into a moisture refuge. And if the temperature gets too hot and there's water around, it still has to find a cool refuge. I think this is the origin of the story that if you put a frog in the water that you gradually bring it to a boil, it won't get out, it will die. Because once their temperature gets too high, even though they've got enough moisture, they actually become moribund. They can't move, they can't escape. So you've got to have both. You've got to have suitable temperature in the range of optimum performance, and you've got to have suitable moisture as well. And they are the two major traits that drive adaptation for amphibians. Now, here's a strange story. All of the experts had two traits to score for ecophysiology, and that was the critical thermal temperature and moisture and capacity to avoid moisture loss. And none of them ranked them in the top 10 traits. Now, either that is because most of the people who did the scoring are ecologists, not physiologists, or they don't understand physiology, or my understanding of physiology is wrong. But it's a very interesting thing that we had 18 experts, all of them work on amphibians, ranked the two physiological traits highly at all. They were in the bottom eight traits. They moved around a bit. Not everybody ranked them the same, but nobody put them in the top 6 traits, for example. So what are we doing, and what has our lab been doing since the fires? And I should say right up front that we've had funding support from the Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. Immediately after the fire, in fact, the fires hadn't really finished, and the Federal Department had done a rapid assessment of priority recovery actions. And they really handed that over to what was called the National Environmental Science Program, the NESP, which is a multi-institute program, multiple universities. And so the Threatened Species Hub of the National Environmental Science Program did a desktop assessment, a little bit like we did. They just listed all the frogs. They overlaid the distribution of the frogs with the extent of the fire and the intensity of the fire. And they did a little bit of a trait assessment. And part of their traits were things that had narrow range and the like, but it wasn't detailed trait assessment. And based on that, they listed 16 species of frog that were listed on the National Threatened Species list, for which they needed actions to address whether the frogs were obliterated by the fire, and if they were, what could be done, and how that would be done. So the first thing was to ask scientists to go out and say, what is the status? What is the status on the ground, so that we can then take actions? So we responded because the grant, a bit of grantmanship, I suppose. The grant was very much based around doing things on ground. It wasn't about research. And a large amount of the funding, and some of your audience would know, a large amount of the funding went to NRMs, local land management, wildlife rescue, because they were doing things on the ground. This is pretty hard for frogs. And we thought long and hard how we could do things that would make a difference. And that's assuming that their assessment was correct, and that what they assessed was that some of these animals would be in really bad shape. And a group of experts made that assessment. It wasn't left to one or two people. So one of the things we put forward was what we call the fire dam project. And an example is the frog I talked about before, Latoria littlejohni. We had something of the order of 5 years pre-fire study, which had identified a large reduction in distribution. The numbers here are references at the end. So we'd been working on littlejohni for another reason, really, to try and understand the taxonomy of littlejohni and the new species watsoni. And as we were doing that, we were getting very strong indications that this frog had gone through a massive reduction in its populations, and we thought chytrid was probably responsible for that. And we were getting into trying to understand that reduction. And of course, then the fires came. And fortunately, about 15 years ago, Frank Lemkirk had done a nice study in the Central Coast Range where he used to work with forestry, where what they did in a production forest was to create, 20 or 30 dams, small fire dams, which are common in the forests in New South Wales. They're not common in southeast New South Wales, I noticed, around Eden, but they are common in central New South Wales, central east New South Wales. In forestry areas, they build fire dams, mainly as places where fire trucks can fill up when they're doing control burns, so they don't have to drive out of the forest. Now, the important thing that Frank had found was of these, let's say it's 20, I'm not sure how many ponds, 15 to 20. Of the 20 ponds that he had that were man-made, he found that Latoria littlejohni occurred in about 7 of them. And that was over several years that he did his study. They're a hard frog to find because they call in winter, they only occur sporadic, they only call sporadically. Most froggos don't go out in winter, but their tadpoles are fairly obvious. And so Frank analysed his data, and after the fires and our knowledge of Latoria littlejohni, it became very clear to us that without the fire dams in the Central Coast Range, there may not even be a population of Latoria littlejohni there. In fact, it's not only to recently we've discovered that there are some what we call natural sites of breeding, but the frog, the population there seems to be totally supported and is resilient because of these man-made ponds. So what we said is that we needed to test to see if building ponds would add resilience to isolated populations. That is, what do we mean by resilience? The measurable thing to improve population genetics and abundance. That's demography, more breeding, more animals. So we put to the government that with our partner organisations, which in this case was the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales, given that they manage the land, we put forward a recovery action for the construction of 40 fire dams, it was, in 3 isolated populations. One down near Eden, where we know the frog really from 2 or 3 wetlands, and I mean tiny wetlands. One west of Bateman's Bay, where we know the frog from only 1 population, 1 breeding site. And we said we'd do pre-construction, post-construction monitoring, try and investigate the role of the disease and dispersal and impacts of creating habitat on other species. But the recovery action was to add resilience to Latoria littlejohni and Latoria watsoni populations. So that's a fire dam project. As I say, we entered into a partnership with Forest Corporation of New South Wales because it's on their land, and the University of Newcastle is to do the monitoring and the science component of the project. The second one is cryobiology. And I know many people find this a really strange one. And that is the collection and storage of what are retrievable gametes. The critical word is retrievable gametes from threatened species. Now, put yourself in the situation It's February 2020. We've just had the fires burning since about June, July of 2019. The Gospers Mountain fire west of Sydney in the Blue Mountains burned for 2 months in rugged country. There was no way of putting that fire out. If there would have been another 40 degrees or 45-degree day with a westerly wind, that fire would have continued right to the coast in the Central Coast and west of Newcastle. It was the break in weather and rainfall that put it out. There was a massive effort from the rural fire services, but at the end of the day, if the weather had turned, that would have been a bad news story. Now, we didn't know whether we would have gone back to some of our populations and whether they were there or not. And I can tell you, because I have been there, it's one of the saddest things of my career, is that I've discovered a species and described it, and I've seen it go extinct. And what we didn't do, and what we tried to do and asked people to do, was, for God's sake, take it into captive husbandry and save some genes so that the future has an opportunity so that it doesn't go extinct. Now, I do come across many other conservation biologists who say, oh, cryobiology is extreme. This is an insurance policy that we don't need right now. And I say, well, I can give you 9 examples in Australia where if we would have taken that, we wouldn't have an extinct species. And it's not just frogs. I cannot understand how a mammal can go extinct in the last decade and we don't have either eggs, embryos, and sperm cryopreserved as an insurance. It's just, it mind boggles me. So the Commonwealth were, kind enough to say, yeah, we'll give you money to collect and cryo-store gametes, that is sperm, from 9 species of threatened frog in New South Wales and from multiple populations to cover the genetic diversity. And that genome bank is now, and our partners there were Taronga Zoo Conservation Society, and they hold that repository of crows and sperm, and they'll hold it in perpetuity in liquid nitrogen in case, I hope it never has to be, but in case we need it to bring back a species or to add genetic diversity to populations that are losing genetic diversity. It's an insurance policy. And if history is, as I've just told you, unfortunately, we will probably need it in the future. So cryobiology, once again, as I say, we had partners there, Taronga Zoo, and ourselves contributed to that. The third program was a before and after impact assessment, where we went out into the field for months to go to historic sites of distribution and abundance and habitat use. We did repeated surveys at historic sites where we had done long-term studies to determine whether the frogs had persisted. We're then now analysing that using occupancy modelling to determine whether we can see an impact of the fire on population abundance and occurrence, so that we can report on what will be management actions mainly for conservation agencies like national parks in New South Wales, local land services, our NRM, catchment management authorities, and forestry corporation. I can say, for example, as a case study, one of the frogs we looked at was Phaloria puei, Pugh's mountain frog. The Commonwealth assessment was that 85% of the range of puei coincided with fire. This is a rainforest frog. 85% of its range was burnt. Why is it such an interesting animal? Because it's got this very derived reproductive biology. You can see its tadpoles in the bottom right corner there. So this is a trait that our experts scored. So is this good or bad? Pugh's mountain frog digs a hole at the first water that occurs on a stream. And I mean pretty much the first groundwater in a rainforest stream where water oozes out of the aquifer and hydrologists would call it a spring. The first place where water appears out of the ground and a pool forms, this is where you find Pugh's mountain frog. And the frog digs a hole in the soft mud where that water oozes out, builds a chamber about 2 or 3 centimeters underground. The male calls from the chamber, the girl comes to the chamber, the eggs are laid in a foamy egg mass, and the tadpoles live their whole tadpole life in the chamber. You can see they've got very large yolky eggs, and that is what they use for development to get them through to metamorphosis. And they metamorphose as frogs about the size of a match head, the red part of a match. They are tiny, 2 or 3 millimeters long. Now, does living underground and having your eggs underground mean that fire doesn't get you, that you rely on groundwater? Probably not. Fire probably doesn't get you. This is a great trait to protect your reproductive stage. But the adult lives in the leaf litter. It doesn't burrow in the leaf litter as far as we know. It just lives its life on the rainforest floor. And so we think the adults would be highly susceptible to fire. They only lay about 20 or 30 eggs. So if something does happen to females, then the recovery would be very slow because they've got a low reproductive output. So they're an upland rainforest specialist. Their range is already fragmented because they just live at the top of very wet mountains north of, in the northern New England range, in the Gibraltar range and Washpool. They're dependent on wet areas and these bogs for reproduction. They've got a slow life history, low number of offspring, and there were many sites that were burnt. And when we went into the field, we could see that. This is what their habitat looked like after the burn. So we're talking about here 8 to 12 months after, 8 months after the burn, the spring. So this is September or October, 8 months after the fires were extinguished. So not all the rainforest burnt completely. You can see, some sort of devastation. Big trees had fallen over. The leaf litter, dry leaf has come down. And this is the stream where they not very lush rainforest anymore. This would have once been moss and ferns and just, a lush rainforest. I should have a comparison. However, what we found is that they persisted across their known range. In the Gibraltar range, Washpool, the Timbara Plateau and the Ewingar range, we found them where we had found them in our work over the last 14 years when we started working on these frogs. We detected calling and breeding in each of the major areas where they found. Abundance. Look, the most animals we counted at a breeding site was 6, and the average was 3. We had many sites with just 1. Now, the question we've got is that different from pre-fire? We don't know because we don't have so very good data on abundance. We have song meters where we were monitoring this frog over a long period of time, about 5 years ago, but only about 5 sites where we had song meters. So one of the other things we did in this large survey was to put out about 50 song meters at known breeding sites where we knew frogs occurred. We did it for 9 species. We only had 50, so we could only have 9 or 10 song meters per species. So we could compare it to our historic song meter data. And I'm yet to do the stats on it, but I'm pretty sure there's been a reduction in abundance, but not distribution. And that's really nice for this frog. And if you want a real shock, when we model what is called the occupancy, using occupancy model, that is, we use a GIS layer of all the suitable streams within its known range, and we measure 10 metres either side of a known breeding site, and there's normally only 1 or 2 breeding sites on a stream. You keep walking down the stream and there's no more. They're at the first soak. The total area that this species lives in is about 20 square kilometres. And when I talk about the stochastic effect of a fire, that is how one major event could cause a species to go extinct, and how climate change is probably already got these animals on the run. It'd be interesting to contrast it with the Phaloria frosti from Mount Baw in Victoria, which many of you would know a lot about. So I've taken much more than a half an hour. That's an hour and 10, naughty boy. I would like to thank and acknowledge the Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment for support. Also the New South Wales Department of Industry and Environment. The rangers and district managers in the many national parks, and I mean many, that we worked in over the last spring and summer to do our work. Forest Corporation of New South Wales for providing us with scientific licenses and access. Of course, a lot of our work is done with volunteers, mainly undergraduate students and graduate students. And of course, all of our work is carried out under animal ethics approval and scientific license approval. So thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing as quickly as I can and give it back to you, Lynette.
Marvellous. Thank you so much, Mike. This is the awkward bit where there's no sort of clapping. Thank you.
I'm glad you are still all there.
Mike, that's absolutely wonderful. Great talk as always. And I'm sure I speak to many, many people in the audience today, no matter how many times you see you talk, there's always something new. So that was really great. Thank you. Have you a few questions to the audience?
I beg your pardon, sorry?
I said, have you got time to answer a few questions for us as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. If you have time, I'm going to do is get it.
Won't get any complaints about going over time, that's for sure. What I'll do is I'll stop the recording though, so that everybody can send their comments